Welcome to Lair the Alchemist, where we discuss all things heavy metal and hard rock. On today's episode, the difference between a remastered and a remixed album. I was originally intending on making a Heavy Thoughts video on reissues and how many reissues do we really need of certain albums, and I still plan on doing that. But I thought before I make this video, I would address this topic because it's something that I see pop up quite often on forums. I see it on like Blabbermouth when some band announces that they're remastering their catalog. And I'll see comments down below that'll say things like, I hope they turn the vocals up on this album. I hope they turn the snare drum down on this album. For instance, when Metallica announced they were going to remaster their catalog, everyone said, boy, I hope on Injustice for All they turn the bass up. Now, what is happening is people are confusing remix with remaster. So let me explain. Now, I just a thing from the beginning here. I don't own a studio. I'm not an audio engineer. I don't even consider myself to be really any kind of hardcore audiophile or anything. So this is just my interpretation of this. If you have more knowledge on it or some aspect that you want to share, please leave it in the comments down below. But this is the way I understand things to be. So when a band records an album, let's go back to in the 70s. In the 70s, a band would record an album, and they would record on the tape. And the tape would be where the multi-track tape, meaning, for instance, the Beatles, they had 4 tracks to work with when they did like Sgt. Pepper. As time went on, you could have 8 tracks, then 24 tracks. It got more and more. And the original multi-track tape is the tape that you can put into the reel-to-reel machine. You can sit down at the soundboard that it's hooked up to, and you can turn things up and down, turn things on and off. A good example of this in action is if you've ever seen these shows Behind the Album or Classic Album Revisited. There's a couple different names they use for these things, where you'll see often the original producer or engineer actually sitting there behind the desk. I've seen this for Queen's A Night at the Opera. They've done one for Black Sabbath Paranoid, Nirvana, Nevermind. I mean, there's a whole bunch of them. And for instance, with the Paranoid one, the producer is sitting there and he will play a song and he'll go, let's just hear Ozzy's vocals. And he mutes everything else and you're just hearing Ozzy's vocals. Or he says, oh, when we recorded the guitar, we did this and we did this. And sometimes you'll even see on these shows, they'll go, oh, here's an extra track. I didn't even know it was there. Here's a tambourine that we never put in the final mix. Those are the multi-track tapes where you can go in, you've got each track for each instrument. You can readjust the levels and do whatever you want with it. What happens is the band records, they make the multi-track tape, the producer sets the levels, and then the tape is usually sent to a mastering engineer, or I may have the steps slightly wrong. A mastering engineer comes in after everything's been recorded, and the mastering engineer makes sure that the levels are the same across all the songs. They set a general EQ setting so that, because back in the day, a band might spend a month or 2 or 3 months recording. And so there might be a song that's a little brighter than all the other songs. So they set the EQ so it's consistent across the album, so that the volume levels are consistent, so that the spacing between the songs is what they want, etc., etc. They prepare it to be duplicated. Once it's ready to be duplicated, they make a master tape. And from that master tape is, again, I'm referring back now to the 70s, where they would use that master tape. In this day and age, it would just be digital, the digital master. You take the master tape, and that is the source from which you make your copies. So, for instance, the Beatles, all right? And this is why record collectors will often want certain editions of a record. Because for the Beatles recorded in the UK, Abbey Road Studios or wherever, So the master tape that came out of Abbey Road Studios, that was master tape number 1. And then what the record company does from there is they make copies from that for the other territories in the world. So if anybody, I know a lot of my subscribers out there are familiar with cassette tapes. When you make a copy, as you keep making copies and you move farther away from source number 1, the master tape, the quality starts to keep getting worse as the more copies you make. So typically, what they would do is take the master, make copies directly from the master, send them to the different territories, send them around Europe, send them to America, send them to South America, or wherever. Sometimes what happens, though, is the master tape is made, it's sent, a copy is made, sent to the US. Then the US makes a copy from the US tape, and maybe they send that from South America. Now you're 2 removed from the master. So the master tape is, everything is mixed, everything's finished on it. I went off on a little slight tangent there with what master tapes and everything, and that might be a topic of another video, what collectors sort of look for when they're searching for vinyl, but that's a little taste of that. So the master tape, everything finished, you can't adjust, turn something up or turn something down in the master tape. It's set. The vocals are set, the bass drum is set, everything's set. When an artist is making a remaster, what they are doing, 99 to my knowledge all the time, is they are taking that master source, the already finished where all the levels are set, and they are just adding stuff to it afterwards. They're adding EQ to it, they're boosting the highs. Unfortunately, please refer to my Loudness Wars video. I won't get into the Loudness Wars, but this is where a lot of this starts. They take a master, they crank the volume up on it, they add a whole bunch of treble to it. So it may give the illusion at times of an instrument jumping out more. If you put a whole bunch of treble on a recording, it's going to make the higher pitch instruments sound like they're jumping out more. If you turn everything up or you add a lot of low end, bottom end, it's going to make it sound like maybe the bass drum is going to sound like it's louder, but they are not altering the levels of the instruments. You could essentially do your own remaster by buying a graphic equalizer. This is something back in the day of my early stereo system. I had like a huge equalizer. I could jack up the volume, I could crank up the bass. Anybody can do this now. You have treble, bass knobs on your stereo, whatever you got. By you adding treble or bass to it, or if you got an equalizer, adding a whole bunch of mid-range, Spotify has an equalizer inside that you can adjust. You're essentially remastering the source, your album, whatever you're listening to. In a way, you're remastering it yourself. So where people get confused is they think that in the remastering process, there's some way that, and in Justice for All, there's no bass guitar because they basically turned it off, that somehow in the remaster, you're going to hear more of the bass guitar. No, it's not going to happen. You're just taking that source and you're brightening up. It's like movies. They take these older classic movies and they brighten it up a little bit, or they just add some filters to it that maybe make it pop a little bit more, but they're not changing the color of the clothes that the person wore in that scene from 1965 or whatever the movie is. You know, they don't have the ability to change that. They don't have the ability to change the lighting that was going on in the room when that particular scene was filmed, but they can add it afterwards. It's like on your camera, you can take a picture and you can brighten up a picture if you want to. You can crop a picture. But if you take a picture in a really dark room, there's only so much you can do to make it brighter. Just like if there's no bass guitar on your recording, if there's no kick drum, there's nothing you're going to be able to do to really bring that back into the recording with a remaster. So I think people get confused a lot of times and they think, oh, a remaster, that's going to completely change the way this album sounds. And no, 9 times out of 10, it's really just adding some treble, some bass. It's making it louder. It's not essentially truly changing anything. Now, a remix is when you have that original multi-track source. If you're doing it digitally, when people record things on Pro Tools, for instance, the original files, you could open up the original Pro Tool files and mute, raise, lower, whatever you want. Change to EQ settings, whatever you want to do. And with the original multi-track tapes, you could do that too. Examples of artists that have done this, Megadeth famously did this when they remixed their catalog. There's, I forget what the song is. I think it's Into the Lungs of Hell, where there's horns in it now that were not in the original. They recorded that song. They had horn sounds on keyboards or real horns. I don't know. They had horns on the original. Somebody made the decision, take those out. So they muted them. So however many pressings and versions were put out without the horns, they went in to remix it and they added those horns back in. I'm trying to think of other examples of people who have remixed, have done this. It's not very common that people go back and do a full remix because a lot of times the artist does not have access to the original master tapes. The original multi-track tapes, excuse me. A lot of times they're lost. Because back in the day, nobody thought that you would go back in 30 years later and readjust the instrument levels. They set it, they made a master tape and said, okay, this is all you really need to make copies is the master tape. You don't need the multi-track tape. So, for instance, Black Sabbath, Tony Iommi wanted to do a remix of Born Again. Born Again is a notoriously bad-sounding album, if you want to put it that way. Some people find a certain charm in it. That's a topic for another video. But he could not find the original multi-track tapes. They have the master tapes because they keep making copies of them. They make copies through all these years. But he could not find the original multi-track tapes. They tried to hunt it down at the studio. A lot of times studios will keep these things. A lot of times studios would just record over the things. Frank Zappa. Here's another good example. Frank Zappa, and I may get some of these details wrong because this was so long ago. When he first put out his stuff on the CD, he had the original multi-tracks, and he went back in and actually remixed, replayed some spots in some of the songs. Another example of a remix, Ozzy, this is a notorious one where Ozzy or Sharon or someone made the decision to go back into Blizzard of Oz and Diary of a Madman, remove the original bass and drums and put in, I believe it was Robert Trujillo, and I don't know who played drums on it, but they went back in, they had the original multi-tracks and replayed the bass and the drums on those original recordings. Rush did the same thing with Vapor Trails. That's a Loudness Wars story. I mentioned that in my Loudness Wars video. That album is notoriously crushed. The original version of it, no dynamics. They eventually did a Vapor Trails remixed where they just went back in and remixed the whole thing. It's not very common. It's something that honestly, this was going to be the topic of my other video, which I'm still going to get to, my heavy thoughts on how many reissues and remasters do we need of certain albums. It reaches a point, we're talking about Black Sabbath, like Paranoid. How many remastered, remastered versions can you have of the same album? And maybe a thing that I would find interesting is if some artists did go in and say, you know what, we're going to do a complete remix. There's extra vocals we never used. There's an extra guitar parts we never used. Here's a tambourine here that wasn't in the original mix. We're going to totally re-envision this. Usually that's a dangerous, slippery slope because when you have classic albums, for better or for worse, regardless of how that album sounded, people are used to it. People have been listening to it like that for so long that even if you, quote, improve it, it doesn't work. Now, don't get confused with when bands actually replay re-record an entire album. Exodus did this with Bonded by Blood. I forget what they called it. Twisted Sister, I believe, did it with Stay Hungry. They called it Still Hungry or something like that, where they actually went into the studio and replayed the songs. That's a totally different thing. So remix, You're actually going into the original multi-track source and you're changing levels within the songs. Remaster, you're taking the finished master, the finished product, and you're doing post-production on it. You're adding EQ, you're changing this, you're brightening this up, making this a little bit louder or whatever. All right, so there you go. There's the difference between a remix and a remaster. I thought I would share that. It has popped up a few times in questions in the comments section. And again, it's something that I see come up rather frequently when bands are talking about remastering or remixing their catalog. And I think that there's sometimes some confusion around this terminology. So hopefully I've shed some light on it. This is my interpretation of it. If there's people out there, more audiophiles or people that do have experience in studios and stuff like that, and you would like to share some of your knowledge on this topic, please do so in the comments. I'd love to read it. So, all right, let me know what you guys think about albums that have been remastered, remixed. What are your thoughts on the whole thing? Stay tuned for heavy thoughts on reissues. How many is too much? Make sure you hit like and subscribe. Lair the Alchemist, Facebook, Twitch. And until we see you again, make sure you stay heavy, stay metal.